elsewhere throughout the world, and to join us in a conference like this in Mexico is wonderful. I'd also like to thank the university for hosting this as well. This is, again, I hope the first of many occasions when we'll be able to come back down and enjoy the wonderful weather you have here.
Not today.
Oh, this is beautiful. Where I left, it was 90 degrees and hot, and it was snow. I mean, you know, so this is this is really, really nice. So let me jump right in. I will be speaking in English for this paper. So this, Berkeley's constitutive notion of mind. As central as the notion of mind is for Berkeley, it's not surprising that what he means by mind stirs debate. At issue are questions about not only what kind of thing a mind is, but also how we can know it. This convergence of ontological and epistemological interests in discussing mind has led some commentators to argue that Berkeley's appeal to the Cartesian vocabulary of spiritual substance signals his appropriation of elements of Descartes' theory of mind. But in his account of spiritual substance, Berkeley focuses much more than Descartes on the intrinsic relation between the mind and its ideas, and less on the nature of the mind itself. This makes it difficult to justify the claim that mind, for Berkeley, is either an object of self-awareness or something that can be conceived apart from the activities or ideas by which it is known. In section 1 of this essay, I discuss Berkeley's view of mind, first by highlighting how it differs from the Cartesian account of mind as an abstraction from the activities in which it engages, and second, by characterizing mind as a principle of differentiation and association of ideas, which itself is not differentiated from or associated with other principles. Since only its ideas differ, the principle or substance on which it is based is different only in a derivative sense. To think of minds in relation to one another would make them objects, and that is exactly what Berkeley insists cannot be done. That is why for him, Berkeley is the substance that informs such differentiation and association, which cannot itself be understood as an object. As I indicate in section 2, this way of speaking about mind means that I am the cognitive and affective cause of my perceptions. I am not the bundle of my ideas or something in which those ideas inhere. Rather, I am the identification of those perceptions in a specific set of relations. I conclude by describing how those relations are always cognitively and affectively conditioned, so that every perception is always in some sense active and characteristic of the self. So my first section, mind is mean as principle of meaning, but it's not an abstract substance. So most commentators agree that for Berkeley, minds are nothing like the things we experience, that is, ideas. Indeed, he warns us, and what I've got in the handout that you have here, these first two quotes here, what he warns in these first two quotes is that to say the mind is a thing, or even exists, is to use words in ways that, he says, have nothing in common with how they are applied to anything else. Nonetheless, he does not refrain from calling minds active or spiritual substances. And this is something from quote number 3, that, quote, support ideas. And he's willing to retain, and if you look at quotes 4, 5, and 6, you'll see that particular point being made here. And he's willing to retain the word substance, despite the fact that its use generates errors in thinking. And that's quote number 7 from the notebooks. So he still hangs on to the word, but he realizes that it can generate some questions in people's minds. That leaves commentators, and the people that I have in mind are specifically people like Margaret Atherton or Walter Ott or McCracken or Mark Hyde or Beardsley. I mean, just there are a bunch of them who do this. That leads some of them to assume that his treatment of spiritual substance follows in large measure the general views of mind developed by his contemporaries, particularly Descartes. Unlike those commentators, however, I will argue that first, Berkeley's notion of spiritual substance is not like that of Descartes. And secondly, that the claim that his notion of mind is Cartesian is based on how he refers to the mind as a substance, which for him means something completely different from Descartes. I will also argue, thirdly, that commentators typically use Descartes' description of spiritual substance to guide their explication of Berkeley's position, thus begging the question about the Cartesian character of his doctrine. I conclude, this is my fourth point, that a semantic account of spiritual substance, in which the term substance is applied to individuals, even though there is nothing those individuals share, more accurately describe Berkeley's doctrine of mind. For Descartes, mind is an object or a thing, a substance that can be conceptually abstracted from its activity of thinking. But for Berkeley, to say that the mind is a substance means simply that its existence consists solely in its activity. As such, mind cannot be abstracted from its activity, for the differentiation and association of ideas is what the mind is, not simply what it does. No doubt we do refer to substances when we talk about things with which we are daily concerned. So the fact that Berkeley does not specify an alternative definition for substance leads some commentators to claim that he encourages his readers to take his use of the term in the quote, routine or traditional sense. After all, he describes mental activities not as attributes or modes of some conceptually distinguishable, though unknown subject of understanding and will, but simply as, in the term that he prefers to use, an active principle by which ideas are perceived or will. And if you look at quote number 8, you'll see that particular point being made. For Berkeley, this allows us to know of minds only in terms of activities that give them their identities. And quotes 9 and 10 do precisely that. Understanding, will, spirit are thus not three things of which we just happen not to have ideas. For to say that would fall into the very abstractionist way of speaking that about spiritual substance that Berkeley repeatedly rejects. In his eyes, just as there is no abstract material substance that underlies or supports sensible qualities, so there is no spiritual substance abstracted from understanding or willing. This non-Cartesian and non-Lockean way of speaking does not treat spiritual substance as if it is some determinate thing distinct from the identification and differentiation of things, for that would still require another principle by which its intelligibility is determined. Rather, for Berkeley, mind is simply an indication that things are identified or, in his terms, perceived as intelligible objects. As such, mind cannot be compared or contrasted to them as another object identified in the language of nature, because it is the principle or activity by which objects are identified as intelligible. Still, a mind is inconceivable apart from its objects, for its identification as this or that principle depends on how its objects are identified in relation to one another. The activity by which individual objects are identified in relation to one another must thus be the very same activity whereby finite minds are also individuated. In this sense, God's communication of ideas to finite minds is identical to his creation of those minds. That's something which I really want to kind of harp on. That is, when God communicates, he is actually constituting or creating the minds to which he's constituting. Just how radically different this Berkeleyan treatment of mind is from Descartes' or Locke's is apparent in how he eschews their assumption that understanding and willing inhere or subsist as attributes or modifications of some purported substance. Because he rejects as an abstraction Descartes' view that a substance can be conceptually distinguished from its defining attribute, he dismisses tout court Descartes' claim, and this is from quote number 11 on your sheet, that since the mind is a thinking thing, there is in addition to the thinking a substance there is in addition to the thinking a substance that does the thinking. Now, I recognize that this particular passage is from the conversation with Berman, and sometimes people will say, conversation with Berman, it's kind of questionable, whatnot. But, and there are, in fact, some passages, for example, if you look at your quotes that I have for you on the quotes 12 and 13, where Descartes seems to acknowledge that we do not know substances immediately, but only in terms of their attributes. And so I can see where someone would say, well, Berkeley sounds like he's saying something similar to what Descartes. But then if you look at quote number 14, it seems like Descartes is falling back to the viewpoint to which I'm attributing his view to here. Berkeley also rejects Locke's idea that thinking is merely a mode of the subject of adhesion, in terms of which substance becomes a supporting spirit, about which we have no clear and distinct ideas. And this is a point that's raised in quote number 15. Accordingly, Berkeley nowhere claims that he adopts a Cartesian or Lockean idea of mind. Indeed, he says just the opposite when he cautions us against referring to spirit as a, quote, being which wills. For as he insists, the cause of ideas is nothing but a will. A being which wills, he says, being unintelligible. So the idea of a being which wills, he says, is flat out unintelligible. But there is certainly the willing. There is nothing but the will. And that therein lies his concept of what a substance is. If you look at quote number 16, you'll see him developing this idea perhaps even more forcefully. If you ask what thing it is that wills, I answer, if you mean idea by the word thing, or anything like an idea, then I say 'tis no thing at all that wills. This, how extravagant soever it may seem, yet is a certain truth. We are cheated by these general terms, thing and is, etc. Again, if by is you mean is perceived or doth perceive, I say, or does perceive, I say nothing which is or does perceive will. Nothing which does perceive wills. He's really explicit about that. Don't think of the self as, or the subject as, something which does do the willing. The willing is what the subject is. It's hard to overemphasize just how central this point is in Berkeley's doctrine of mind. There is no spiritual substance that is even conceptually distinguishable from the specific activities that define it. Not only is such distinction in Descartes' terms difficult, it is simply wrong-headed, because it requires that we abstract spirit from its defining activity. As Berkeley notes, and this is quote 17, whoever shall go about to divide in his thoughts or abstract the existence of a spirit from its cogitation will, I believe, find it no easy task. Indeed, in a letter to Samuel Molyneux dated December the 8th, 1709, Berkeley pointedly criticizes Descartes for distinguishing betwixt himself and cogitation. For as far as Berkeley is concerned, there is no difference between mind and his mental activity. Here an objector could point out that Berkeley explicitly refers to mind, spirit, or soul as a, quote, perceiving active being, or a real thing, or a thing which thinks and wills and perceives. According to some commentators, that indicates how the notebook passages to which I have cited are not really representative of Berkeley's, quote, considered published pronouncements. But by distinguishing the notebook cautions against thinking of the mind as a thing, these commentators end up treating his published pronouncements in ways that make mind into an abstraction, all to guarantee that Berkeley's notion of spiritual substance retains features consistent with those of Descartes and Locke. If, however, Berkeley's notebooks and principles are not treated as if they're based on Cartesian or Lockean principles, his views on mind are both constant and consistent throughout his unpublished and published works. Like Leibniz, Bayle, Jonathan Edwards, and even in a sense Spinoza, Berkeley can thus be understood as characterizing mental substance as nothing other than one simple, undivided, active being, the active principle of motion and change of ideas that identifies a determinate sequence of activities. For him, there is no abstractable substance beneath those activities or conceptually distinguishable from them, for mind is understood as nothing other than the cause in terms of which ideas are identified. In such a Neoplatonic way of speaking of substance or principle, there is, as he says in the Principles, there is not any other substance than than spirit. Because apart from the activity of spirit or mind, nothing has an identity or is intelligible, not even individual minds. Therefore, the activities of individual minds as particular sequences are themselves differentiated only derivatively and retroactively as the will that there be objects that are differentiated and related. That's why for Berkeley, spirit is not a substance that just happens to will. Rather, because it is the will that there be objects. It, and again, here I'm focusing on spirit, it, unlike bodies, cannot be an object and cannot be known. Nor can the mind be said to engage in willing, for that would imply that the distinction between mind and its acts of volition can be understood as logically prior to the volition that there be such a distinction. And as he says in quote number 18, "'Tis folly to define volition as an act of the mind ordering, for neither act nor ordering can themselves be understood without volition." So you couldn't even say this is an act without already willing that there be the act. And then, of course, you'd have to say, well, then what about that act? And so on. It'd be an endless cycle. Accordingly, Berkeley insists that we not think of mental substances as things that engage in activities such as willing. And this is quote number 19, where he makes this particular point. The substance of spirit we do not know, it not being knowable. It being purus actus, pure act. The will is purus actus, or rather pure spirit. Substance of a spirit is that it acts, causes, wills, operates, or if you please, to avoid the quibble that may be made about the word it, and this is a kind of a significant particular qualification, that rather than saying that it, the substance, is something that does these things, he prefers to just simply say it's simply to act, to cause, will, operate. Its substance not knowable. Its substance is not knowable because it's not an idea. Berkeley's key point here is that there is no discernible thing that perceives or wills. That is, there is no spiritual substance other than the pure activity by which things are differentiated and identified. However extravagant and unfamiliar this might sound to someone entrenched in a Cartesian or Lockean mentality, this is the context in which we have to understand Berkeley's notion of mind as active principle. It is a context in which we can still refer to mental substances as things, but in doing so, we do not mean the same thing as Berkeley's contemporaries do. In Berkeley's view, the schoolmen, Descartes, Locke, and others labor under the grammatical burden of thinking will and understanding are activities of some thing that underlies or supports them. But thinking about substance that way is simply wrong, because it fails to appreciate how saying that something is a substance is saying, again in Neoplatonic, not Aristotelian terms, that it is the active, efficient cause or metaphysical principle of things, not a transitive cause. This means that the mind itself has no identity or nature other than the activity of differentiating and relating objects of experience, that is, ideas. This is the sense in which a mind is unlike anything we experience. As Berkeley emphasizes, and this is the passage number 20 on your sheet there, I do not ask about its nature. I only ask whether you admit that there is a principle of thought and action. So he's not interested in telling me about the mind or the soul, but rather it as a principle of thought and action whereby ideas are differentiated and distinct and associated. About whether there is such a principle, he of course has no doubt. But he refuses to ask about its nature because it has no identity. Rather, it is the reason why things have natures and identities. We can have no ideas of mind simply because mind is the principle by which ideas themselves become meaningful and significant. And it is in this sense that the words mind and spirit are said to mean or signify something. In short, mind is the meaning, intentionality, or intelligibility of ideas rather than a thing that can be conceived apart from its ideas. Correspondingly, ideas can be the signs of other ideas precisely because signification is a mental activity. That is why for Berkeley, it is impossible to perceive anything at all without representing it in some way or other. And that means that every perceived thing must be perceived as an expression in a language of nature, in a language that is the language of nature. To understand what an idea means is therefore to see it not only in the context of a language, but also as an object of mind, for a mind is nothing other than the active perceiving or willing of ideas in patterns of significance. I therefore have a notion of myself to the extent that I understand myself to be the cause by which ideas are identified and related. Indeed, my existence as a self consists in perceiving and willing those ideas, and only in perceiving and willing ideas do I exist and know that I exist. As Berkeley remarks in, well, this is a quote that I don't have on your sheet here, to say that the mind exists without thinking, he says, is a contradiction. Nonsense, nothing. For, and now I do have a quote from 21 here, for he says, consciousness, perception, the existence of ideas, and I'm focusing here on the existence of the ideas, not the ideas themselves, seem all to be one. My knowledge of my existence is my knowledge of a certain sequence of ideas whose identities and relations are known in my knowing them in relation to one another. In this way, the very existence, as he says, of ideas constitutes the soul. Not in the sense that a soul is a Humean bundle of ideas, but in the sense that the mind is the foundation or substance of the particular system of signs that identifies things in a certain order. The most forceful expression of this point appears in Berkeley's Principles manuscript, where he not only dismisses the possibility of a spirit's existing without perceiving, but also links the conceivability of the existence of spirit to language. And this is quote number 22. Sure I am that I should tell that should anyone tell me that there is a time wherein a spirit exists without perceiving, or an idea without being perceived, or that there is a third sort of being which exists though it neither wills nor perceives nor is perceived, his words would have no other effect on my mind than if he talked in an unknown language. 'Tis indeed an easy matter for a man to say the mind exists without thinking, but to conceive a meaning that may correspond to those sounds, or to frame a notion of a spirit's existence abstracted from its thinking, this seems to me impossible. You can't even begin to think about a mind apart from its engaging in this particular activity, or the engagement, rather than saying its engagement. I want to beg the question by referring to its. In tying the existence of minds directly to the intelligibility of the claims that minds perceive, Berkeley indicates that the existence of mind cannot be distinguished from its activities, even if only conceptually. You can't even do it conceptually, which is the route that I suspect is what Descartes wants to pursue. Because even a conceptual distinction is ultimately based on an initial activity or principle. When Berkeley says that the soul no longer exists than it thinks, he means to draw attention to the fact that thinking is not simply an essential property or attribute of mind. Rather, mind is perceiving and willing. It may be identified, and again, this would be derivatively, by the things it perceives and wills, but it is not reducible or identical with the things it perceives and wills. In sum, mind, soul, or spirit is not a bundle of ideas or an imaginable substance in which ideas can inhere, but the formal cause by which ideas are identified or as differentiated yet related signs of one another. In willing and perceiving, it becomes a particular mind in virtue of the products of its activities of willing and perceiving. But its individual, quote, acts of perception or volition do not exist prior to the ideas whose existence they constitute. As such, willing and perceiving occur simultaneously. We will that there be a distinction between an object and other things, and that they be related to one another. And in doing so, we perceive the thing as opposed to and in relation to those things. But since a distinction is not something we do or make as much as it is something we are, we do not exist prior to such an act. Or more properly put, we come into existence in virtue of the fact that such distinctions and relations are made. Not by someone else, for example, God, but because those distinctions are made and those relations are created. In this way, we are individuated in the act of perceiving certain relations of ideas, both affectively and cognitively. Accordingly, Berkeley's theory of mind is integrally related to his theory of knowledge, in that in knowing something in relation to other things, we define ourselves as and in the affective and cognitive relations of those things. For Berkeley, then, every perception always includes an active volitional component to the extent that it identifies what we experience as being a specific thing or kind of thing. That we experience anything at all is not something we get to choose or will, and thus perception is passive in that it is not based on a specific decision we make. Indeed, to the extent that any particular perception is considered simply in terms of its givenness, it is properly a sensation rather than a thought. For, as he says in quote 23 on your sheet there, thoughts do most properly signify or are mostly taken for the interior operations of the mind, wherein the mind is active. But those that obey not the acts of volition and in which the mind is passive are more properly called sensations or perceptions. That is, sensations are ideas we perceive as conditioned in terms of a particular sense, and thoughts are ideas that are understood as being caused by the mind. To the extent that we recognize what we perceive as one kind of thing rather than another, for example, a color versus a sound, to the extent that we do this, we make judgments that mark out the existence of the specific things, for example, a horse, and actively identify it as something that can be thought of otherwise, that is, not a horse or a cow. In this sense, we do not experience things in the world in a purely passive way. Rather, we experience them as related to one another in terms of categories by which they are represented as being this or this as opposed to that sort of thing. Even when we seem to perceive things in a purely passive way, for example, as in smelling a flower or seeing the sun, we specifically perceive a scent or color. That is why when we perceive something, it must not be entirely new, but have something in it old and already perceived by me. To know that red is similar to yellow, but not round or sweet, is not something I am simply given by experiencing something red. Rather, it is essential to the conditions of my experience, including how all ideas are represented as components in the language of nature. This is the sense in which perception is active. There is thus much more at issue here than simply the claim that in perceiving an object, the mind is attentive or focuses its awareness. That would allow for blind agency, in that it would allow us to perceive some particular thing without being aware of what it is we perceive. Instead, for Berkeley, perception is active when it is the perception of objects as those objects. And since we never perceive anything other than as determinate sensible objects, and other than determinate sensible objects as objects of our minds, we never perceive any idea without judging it to be in some determinate relation to ourselves. And this is the quote note 24 that I'm drawing this from. It seems there can be no perception, he says, no idea without will, being there are no ideas so indifferent, but one had rather have them than annihilation, or annihilation than them. To say, therefore, that perception is the passive reception of ideas still allows us to say that in identifying ideas as specific ideas, the mind is active in perceiving. For apart from perceiving specific ideas, the mind does not perceive at all. Furthermore, the specification of what we perceive is not something we will, for we do not will ourselves into existence as the perceivers of specific sensible objects. Instead, we exist solely as the volitional activity that there be such objects in such relations. And this is from quote 25 here. While I exist or have any idea, I am eternally, constantly willing. My acquiescing in the present state is willing. Just as we cannot exist without having some idea or other, because some ideas or other I must have, he says, so long as I exist or will, so we cannot exist as spiritual substances without willing that there be specific thoughts, the existence of which being combined, he says, make all substances. But we do not determine the ideas we actually perceive by sense, just as we do not determine whether we perceive at all. That's up to God or other spirits. As Berkeley puts it in the Principles, and this is quote 26, whatever power I may have over my thoughts, I find the ideas actually perceived by sense do not have a like dependence on my will. When in broad daylight I open my eyes, it's not in my power to choose whether I see or know, or to determine what particular objects shall present themselves to my view. And so likewise as to the hearing and other senses, the ideas imprinted on them are not creatures of my will. There is therefore some will or spirit that produces them. Because I do not determine the sequence of ideas that I perceive, I do not choose when or whether I have perceptions. But I do have a role in how the object is perceived. For apart from my sensing the object, it would not exist. That is why Berkeley tells Samuel Johnson in that the soul of man is passive as well as active. The two aspects of the mind cannot be separated, for every thought is a thought of something, and no specific thing can be understood apart from its being thought as that thing. To understand, comprehend, or simply know what a thing, for example, a cherry tree, is simply to perceive it as opposed to something else, for example, an orange tree, which is exactly what the mind does when it considers its ideas, or chooses, rejects, examines, deliberates, decrees, or in one word he says, acts upon them. So understanding is in some sort, he says, an action that is not distinct from particular perceptions or ideas, nor is understanding really distinct, he says, from the will. For to think of it as a faculty distinguishable from the activity of mind is to ignore how both understanding and will are crucial in the perception of a particular idea. Particular perceptions are thus meaningful only as ideas that result from the activity of the mind, that is, will. No doubt, and this is quote 27 on your sheet, there can be perception without volition. He acknowledges that, because the fact that we perceive is passive in a way that our perceptions of specific things are not. The specificity that we give the perceptions is going to be the active part. The fact that we're having such a thing, that's the passive part. That is why Berkeley claims distinct from or without perception, there is no volition. Therefore, neither is there existence without perception. Since the essence of a mind or spirit consists in the activity of perceiving ideas, if there were no sensible ideas, there could be no soul, he says, no perception. Accordingly, the mind is active in virtue of perceiving or thinking of things as specific things, that is, ideas, in determinate relations, and it is passive in virtue of having those specific ideas that identify it as this or that mind. In short, we do not experience things in the world in a purely passive way. Rather, we experience them as related to one another in terms of categories by which they are represented as being this or that sort of thing for us. Even when we seem to perceive things in a purely passive way, for example, as in smelling a flower or seeing the sun, we specifically perceive this kind of scent or those kinds of colors. That is why when I perceive something, and this is quote number 28, it must not be entirely new. So when you perceive something, it's not entirely new, the perception, but have something in it old and already perceived by me. In virtue of being a mind, I thus know what it means to express the world as meaningful. Indeed, as a mind, I am a particular expression of how things in the world are signs of one another. And the more I recognize how the objects of my experience signify one another in an intended harmonious way, the more I affirm my immortality by expressing a unique way of apprehending the world. For Berkeley, then, A mental substance is not something that can be conceptually distinguished from its activities. Unlike Descartes and Locke, he does not think that those activities can be considered attributes or properties of a substance, even as in the case of Descartes, when they are essential properties by which a substance is known. For Berkeley, this merely conceptual distinction makes mind into an abstraction, inasmuch as it retains the Aristotelian dual characterization of substance as, on the one hand, a substance or substratum of properties that, on the other, does not depend on anything else for its existence. So my concluding remarks here. My focus has been on Berkeley's critique of treating spiritual substance in terms of the first of these two features, namely, as the subject of attributes. And I've said little about the second feature, that is, its independence. There are two reasons for this, that is why I'm making that distinction, and why I'm focusing primarily, or have been focusing primarily on the first. First, if individual minds are merely the result of God's will, that there be sequences of activities differentiated from one another only by their objects, then human minds seem little more than the mental equivalents of material objects, and that begins to make Berkeley sound a lot like Spinoza. But Spinoza does not equate the content of thought, namely extension or body, with matter, nor does he describe substance as essentially material, or as the totality of individual things. Indeed, instead, like Berkeley, Spinoza characterizes the divine principle or cause of corporeal differentiation as natura naturans. And that same point informs Berkeley's comment that, and this is from Cyrus, quote 29 here, God alone exists. And the minute I read that, I said, oh, does that sound like Spinoza? And there's a reason for it. So by describing God and other spiritual substances as causes or principles of differentiation and association, rather than as Aristotelian, Cartesian, or Lockean substances, neither Spinoza nor Berkeley fell into Descartes' embarrassingly ad hoc description of finite minds as independent substances that turn out not to be really independent at all because they rely on God for their existence. My second reason for having said little about Berkeley's consideration of finite minds as independent spiritual substances is that such a discussion assumes that we can be free only if we are things that are distinct from God. But for Berkeley, this strategy creates a problem that can be avoided by thinking of spirits not as independent substances or things that happen to engage in certain activities, but as determinate sequences of purposive activity. But if God is the pure act or undetermined will, that there be determinate sequences of volitions and acts of perception that constitute our minds, then it seems we cannot be said to be free. For how can our volitions or perceptions be truly ours if God wills that we have them in the very act of creating us? Berkeley dispenses with this question simply by noting how it's based on a mistaken notion of substance in which God and spirits are abstracted from their activities. As I have indicated, for Berkeley, the will that there be objects for my consciousness, and thus that there be a consciousness that can be called mine, does not have a determined identity prior to the activity by which it is identified. And so this is my last quote from the sheet here, question 30. This is what he says. The spirit, the active thing, that which is the soul or God, is the will alone. So God and finite minds are distinguished only by the extent, the complexity, the harmony of their objects. As the causes of those objects, spiritual substances are thus free because nothing determines them to be what they are other than their own activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Stephen Daniel for his talk. And now we pass with Pedro Stepanenko reply.
So thank you very much. Thank you for your excellent paper. I would like to have a formal reply. Actually, I have some notes from which I will improve some commentaries, specifically 3 commentaries. And one is concerned with this reduction of substance or substantiality to pure activity. It seems to me, well, Steve contrasts Berkeley's conception from Descartes and Locke's conception. But I think that there is a trend in the whole modernity, to reduce substance to activity. And I'm not only thinking on Leibniz and Berkeley. I think that it is still, it is already in Descartes the doubt that there is something else. It is true that Descartes writes and says repeatedly that there is a substance, that there is something that thinks, but I think there is a doubt. Remember Hobbes' objection to Descartes, the main one. Hobbes said Descartes is making substance from an activity. He confuses activity from a substance. From Hobbes' point of view, the inference of the cogito is from thinking to a material substance, because there must be something that thinks, and that is the material substance. Hobbes said, no, Descartes made a substance only from the activity. So I think that there is a trend already in Descartes to make substance only activity. Think on Locke. Yes, he talked about material substance and spiritual substance, but think or remember how Locke solved the problem of personal identity. Personal identity doesn't depend neither on material substance nor on spiritual substance, but only on consciousness. And consciousness could be understood as conscious thinking, the activity of thinking. So I think we have in Locke also this trend to reduce, in some sense, the principle of our existence in pure activity, pure thinking. Not to talk about Leibniz. Leibniz clearly is. I don't know whether Berkeley read Leibniz. I guess it did, and is very influenced by him, because Leibniz stressed a lot that the soul is thinking, and also this relation between percipi and appetitio is very close to the bishops, to Berkeley's view. Kant also stresses a lot that thinking, that the I is only the activity to synthesize the plurality of given intuitions, and that our receptivity or our passive power to receive representations depends on the activity. There is a resemblance very clear there between Kant and Berkeley. I'm sure that Kant knew Berkeley's work. Fichte also stressed a lot the idea that we are activity, and he struggled to find a word to express consciousness of action, not as something already made, but something that is happening, Tat Handlung. And finally, Hegel, in a very eloquent way, says that substance is only change or something. So I think that the whole modernity represents this idea that the principle of our existence is the activity of thinking. And I would say that the contrast would be better the Aristotelian conception of Middle-Age philosophy, especially Thomism. Well, that's my first commentary. I don't know what you think about it. I really like how Steve describes or explains what is mind. At some point, he says that it is the intentionality of ideas. So it is what makes that the ideas represent something and put them together in relations. I like it because I am a Kantian and I like the idea of unity of a perception. And precisely, I think that the unity of a perception in Kant is, what is my interpretation, is like a space of inferential relations. So there is a strong similarity with the description or Steve's explanation of mind in Berkeley, no? As a ground of a system of science. So mind and language are related, and there is also this idea that our capacity to have passive ideas depends on our activity. Now, I think that from this idea, we can have an argument against empiricism. Or that is the way I sometimes teach Kant. Because, look, if a condition to receive ideas is the activity of thinking, and thinking depends on applied concepts, then we need always a concept to acquire an idea, a sensation. I would say after hearing Steve that is the case also in Berkeley. But what happens with the first sensations that we have? At some point, you I don't know whether you read it, but I read it in the first version that Berkeley says that we don't have only one sensation, but we have to compare sensations, and then we can recognize and associate sensations. So what happens when we first have a sensation of certain kind? I would say, well, we need a concept, a more abstract concepts, but then we have a regress, an infinite regress of empirical concepts, or we accept that the structure of thinking brings some concepts, a priori concepts, that make possible the first empirical concepts from which we then continue to have experiences of all kinds. But from the very beginning, we need some concepts in order to acquire the sensations. So, and that's well, it's, something not comfortable with the empiricism of Berkeley. I don't know whether I explain. I apologize for my English, but I think it's enough to read it. And the point is related to self-knowledge. How does Steve understand self-knowledge in Berkeley? I know that it isn't the topic of the paper, but he touched twice the self-knowledge, and in two very different senses. One in the sense that we don't know ourselves, because our mind focuses always on something else. Concerning this idea, this view of self-knowledge, I would express a Kantian question. So why can we say that there is anything that thinks if we cannot know ourselves? I mean, if we don't know ourselves, we cannot exclude that we are a thing that thinks. I mean, we only know that we are active, but we don't know ourselves because we are always focused on ideas. So we cannot exclude the possibility that we are a thing that thinks, because we don't know what we are. That is concerning the idea that we have knowledge of ourselves. But in other places, Berkeley said that we know ourselves through knowing our ideas. That is, in Kantian terms, that would be the difference between empirical self-knowledge, this last one, and the first one, well, the transcendental perception, which is problematic because in Kant is something like a window to the unknown, and that doesn't seem to be in Berkeley something like a window to the unknown. No, we know that we are only thinking, only activity, but we don't know ourselves. How is that possible? How we can? Well, there are two questions here. No, I mean, why Berkeley is saying that we are not a thing that thinks, when he says that we don't know ourselves, and how to reconcile this idea that we don't know ourselves with the idea that we know ourselves through knowing our ideas, our sequence of ideas, and not in the sense of human, because there is something else. That's the bundle of impressions and ideas. Those are my commentaries, so that they are short, but I'm going to start the session of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pedro. So we have like 10 minutes for your answer, and then we can open a really brief Q&A. So.
Okay, very quickly, thank you for those comments. I like the idea of that substance and activity go together, and I especially like the association with Leibniz. I think there is a real parallel there in terms of that. The fact that they both read one another's works, not everything, of course, and so on, but they were aware of one another's existence and certainly had looked at some of the work. I don't want to say necessarily there's mutual influence, but there seemed to be a convergence of some of their ideas. As far as the idea that maybe other people, for example, Descartes or perhaps even Locke, would see, I mean, I think Locke's discussion of personal identity gets closer to what Berkeley's talking about in terms of defining the self in terms of activity. That's true. I'm still bothered by, and again, you know, the quote that I referred to, the conversation with Berman when he says there's the thinking, but also the thing that does the thinking. And a lot of people could say, well, that was just Berman. That was Berman reading into something that he heard Descartes say when he was copying down his conversations. But there are enough other places which at least open up the possibility. I'm not averse to reading Descartes as saying there is no such thing as even an abstract notion of the self beyond the activity of the self. If we want to read Descartes that way, I think it would really revise the way that we typically have been exposed to Descartes. So maybe your revision is a welcome revision. That does tie all these figures together. I mean, Hobbes, the focus on the material, of course, that's the real problem there. But I think, again, his focus is on activity. And if all of them are saying fundamentally the same thing, then if it takes Berkeley to bring that to the fore, wonderful. I mean, he becomes then the pivot point, not the the lapdog who's thrown off to the side when you're pulling your intro classes together, and you say, well, who do we leave out? And you say, well, we're going to do Descartes definitely, and you've got to do, you know, Locke, and you maybe have to throw in the Hume or whatever. But Berkeley often gets eliminated because of that. I think Berkeley becomes a crucial figure in that respect. And intentionality, again, I agree. That's the heart of my approach. And so the intentionality of ideas, that's what I mean by mind, and not something distinct from it. So second point, I was right on board with that one. We on the third point, or the extended third point here. You ask about what about that very first moment when we experience something? And I think it's like learning a language. The very first time you hear a word, you don't know what it means. The child, for example, who hears a sound, and it's only in relating the sound to other sounds, differentiating it. And I'm thinking more structuralistic way here, speaking of being able to differentiate these things and associating their differentiations and associations, that we develop to begin to get a sense of the meaning of a word. And I think the same thing goes with perception. First time you experience something, you don't experience anything at all until you start differentiating and associating. Then you start carving out a world. It's the blooming, buzzing confusion that we begin to differentiate in terms of we can be able to carve out of the world that we experience different things like glasses and tables and so on. So I think that that's perfectly consistent with Berkeley's point about saying there's never a moment when you say, here's the moment when I first experienced yellow or first experienced solid. There's the experience something and I don't know what it is, and I gradually differentiate it, and then I get a sense of what it is. So. And then
can I say something
concerning
this point? Yeah, but you would say that the child pick up and retains the sensation, and then the second, and then the third.
What do you think?
Well,
I don't think so.
I don't know.
I don't think so. I think the child, a lot of times the kid's grabbing his stuff and whatnot. He doesn't know he's touching something or whatnot, and then something fights back at him, and he's surprised. I mean. It's like when the child is looking up at the little mobile that's hanging above the crib, and he's just kind of doing this, and he grabs it.
But you need memory, you know.
Sure.
Memory, and memory is that you can store the sensation.
But what are you storing though? That's the thing. Yeah. I mean, if the child hits something, does he remember hitting something, or it takes a couple of 3 times before he begins saying, oh, there's that thing that I'm hitting, and I don't know if I'm hitting anything at all. And so I think it takes a while to get used to differentiating the world as you experience it. And it's not something you first have and then you sort of, aboriginal.
Well, the Kantian idea is that we need some very basic concepts from the very beginning in order to receive.
Yeah, that's why Berkeley's not a Kantian.
But I would say that is the reason why he's not a consistent philosopher.
Oh,
concerning that point.
Only Kant's a consistent philosopher? I mean,
concerning that point.
Okay. So
that's it.
So we can have like 5 minutes if we can gather a couple of questions and maybe answer them later. So Enrique.
Thank you very much, Stephen. You never disappoint. I really like this, and I mean, my way of reading Berkeley is exactly like that. I mean, how I interpret mind dependence in Berkeley is not that he's saying that our ideas, right, inhere, right, in the mind, but that they are dependent. Right? So our ideas, our perceptions depend on the mind, right? But that doesn't necessarily entail inherence. So dependence doesn't necessarily entail right inherence, right? So I like that. Now my question is, what about animals? I mean, I'm going to be speaking about right animal minds in Berkeley and Descartes. How does this? What does it tell us about animal minds?
I think it is more limited. That is, I don't think there's a significant difference qualitatively that animals, but they just simply don't make the connections. and the relationships don't get developed as they do for us. But we seem to think that there's some kind of abstract way of thinking that the animals don't share that we have. And I think that's just simply it's not giving enough credit to the animals, or perhaps giving ourselves too much credit.
It can seem something really quickly about the. I will not.
So let me include the other questions, and yes, Laura and then Alberto.
When you say that Berkeley is really far different from Hume, but in notebooks there is a phrase that it's interesting. Good ideas and you put the mind, and without ideas you get out the mind. So it is really very, very close.
Sounds Humean, doesn't it?
Yes, it sounds. And well, I understand that finally your semantic account of Berkeley can be very interesting to understand the order in the ideas you get. Because
that's right.
It's not the bound of ideas, but the order. And I suppose it is very important to make more insist in that conception of the order in ideas.
I hope so. If I say put the ideas, you put the mind, but it's the putting of this idea as opposed to that idea in relationship to that. That's not what Hume was talking about. He's talking about the ideas already having been differentiated, established. Grab all those preformed things, and then you got the mind. And that's not Berkeley's claim that he's making it. That's right. This, which sounds like very Humean, is not Humean at all in the notebooks. That's right.
Okay. Okay. And finally, we pass with Alberto.
Steve, thank you again. Just said I have in the last part of your presentation, you asked like what happened if God is a pure act, and determine or undetermined will that determine sequence of volitions and acts of perception that constitute our minds. So what happened with the freedom? You asked something like that. And so at the end you said, as the cause of those objects, spiritual substance are thus free because nothing determines them to be what they are, other than their own activities. So just my question is, some years ago, I remember I was talking with a colleague, and he asked me what happened with free will or freedom and something like that. And so, well, I'm guilty because I haven't thought so much since then, but I was thinking, how can I reconcile if God is pure activity in some way, determine, as you said, you use the word, determine volitions and acts of perception with the freedom of a man. As you said at the end, their own activities is what make the free of a mind. How can I reconcile these? Because I'm not so much clear about it. Can you tell me something about it?
Well, I think basically the shift that I'm referring to at the end there is that most people think that if God's kind of calling all the shots, then we're not free because somehow we're distinct from the constitution that we are in virtue of our having those ideas. So if I say, are human beings free, then I have to ask, well, how did the human beings come into being? And it's always in terms of perceptions. Prior to the perceptions, there is no human being. There is no mind. So if somebody says, how can a human being be free in the way that I've described it? And the answer is, the human being doesn't exist prior to those having those ideas. So it's not like there's something which is a mind that then has ideas, and that mind is determined and not free. There is no mind. Scratch that. So differentiations of ideas are what constitute us, and there is nothing that determines us other than the ideas that we have in those sequences. And so if someone says, are you free to be yourself? Well, you are yourself, and yourself means the differentiation of ideas. And there's nothing prior. That's the way I get around the freedom question.
Okay. So we will continue with this discussion. And thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much, Pedro. And thank you very much, all of you. We can take only 5 minutes, please, so to continue with the next talk about. Thank you very much. So the question that I